Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. This is Wall Street, New York City. Most unlikely location for this episode of The New Explorers, for it was here 300 years ago that the first enslaved Africans were sold in the North. They also built early New York City. And yet, for those 3 centuries, the issue has been largely covered up. You won't find it featured prominently in the New York history books. And yet it's here, recently discovered, right beneath our feet.
New York City. One place where people have seen it all. For years, it was thought that nothing could shock a New Yorker. But then in May 1991, in the center of Manhattan's Municipal District, 2 blocks from City Hall, a mile from Wall Street, there was a stunning discovery.
From Fox 5, this is the 10 o'clock news.
It's a graveyard right in the heart of downtown, and it's already surprising some historians.
While government officials have withheld comment and have sealed the site from the public, Fox News has learned that archaeologists have discovered a historic site at this location at 290 Broadway.
The discovery came as a construction crew prepared to dig a foundation for a new federal office building. There were the bones of a human being buried long ago. Within 1 week, 11 skeletons had been found, and news of more kept coming. Who were these people? What secret of history had been uncovered? A search into the historic archives reveals the answer. More than 200 years ago, this stretch of land near Broadway had been the Negroes' burial ground. Many of the skeletons discovered here were those of Africans, enslaved by the British colonists who settled New York. Until now, slavery had been thought to be the embarrassment of the South, but suddenly the world could see graphic evidence of people held as slaves in the North. The story of the burial ground made national headlines. And in Washington, D.C., at Howard University, the African American Research University, Michael Blakey watched with particular interest. Blakey is a biological anthropologist, a scientist who studies the biology of human populations.
This was an extremely important archaeological site. Here is a population, skeletal population that is both African and African American, in that it's at the origins of what would become the African American people.
Mark Mack is also a biological anthropologist at Howard. He saw the graveyard, as many did, as a rare opportunity.
For the majority of African American people, we do not know where our ancestors come from. We say the continent of Africa, but the continent of Africa is so large and so genetically diverse. I hope that we can learn more of ourselves, and Americans as a whole can learn more of the African contribution to what has made this country.
Meanwhile, in New York, an army of archaeologists worked to locate and excavate the skeletons. After 3 months of work, the remains of 100 bodies had been found. It was said that this was just a small corner of a large cemetery where thousands of African men, women, and children had been buried from as early as 1712 until the end of that century. But then, as New York grew and room was needed for expansion, it was covered over with landfill, and with it, many believe, the history of slavery in New York was buried. It was not widely known that at one time, New York had one of the largest enslaved populations in all the colonies, and that slavery existed in New York until as late as 1827. For most people in the city, the discovery of the burial ground came as a complete surprise. Cheryl LaRoche is an archaeological conservator who would eventually work on artifacts discovered at the burial ground.
I am a New Yorker. I have been educated in the New York school systems on and off, and I was amazed to discover, first, that Africans and African Americans were in Manhattan and involved in New York history as early as they were. This was a complete shock and never mentioned in any of the history books.
Now, as the skeletons were unearthed, a new history would be told.
These people provide testimony of what the reality of colonial America was. These are the people that built the cities. These are the people that put the bricks down and the cobblestones in the streets, that built the buildings, that built the ports. These people are as important as any other people who have contributed to this country.
As the work continued, 100 more skeletons were excavated. The total was up to 200. With them, there were some puzzling findings. A symbol on the outside of a coffin. Was it a heart? Another had beads placed close to the waist. They raised questions to be answered later. Other skeletons gave more obvious evidence of personal drama. A woman buried with a newborn child. Another had a musket ball lodged in the back. The hardship of the lives was already evident, and many saw the excavation of the bodies as adding insult to injury, as sacrilege. As news of the burial ground spread, more and more African Americans came to honor those buried in what was now called the African burial ground.
It really became the good fight for many of the descendant community.
In that way, that's not morning, very well, very well.
They saw the skeletons not as scientific specimens, but as ancestors who deserved to rest in peace.
Stop the digging. Do for my ancestors what you would demand that I do for your ancestors.
The lines were drawn for a heated political fight. On one side, an agency of the federal government, the General Services Administration, was interested in completing a 34-story, $276 million office building. On the other side, African Americans wanted to stop the desecration of a sacred place.
There is a slogan that seems to be going around the community right now that is borrowed from an old Negro spiritual, which says, "Some of them bones is my mother's bones come together for to rise and shine. Some of them bones is my father's bones, and some of them bones is mine." So there is a sense of a very, very personal connection that our community has with the African burial ground, because this is about family.
Adding to the concern of the community was a growing mistrust over the fact that the people in charge of the excavation included no African Americans. A decision had not yet been made about who would study the bones, and Blakey felt they belonged at Howard.
It was important, ultimately, to allow African Americans, in this case, those who are experienced and capable of doing this kind of work, to tell our own story.
Way over in Beulah land, way over in Beulah land.
As the months dragged on, the movement against the government grew.
Way over in Beulah land, way over in Beulah land. We're gonna have a good time.
Town meetings were called.
brothers and sisters are not too proud of slavery. But we were the slaves. We were the slaves, and our magnificence is in our survival.
Had it not been for the bodies and the bones, the body and the labor of those people who rest yonder, our ancestors, there wouldn't have been a United States of America. There wouldn't have been any wealth in the Western world. We are authorized by God to insist that this government give the proper memorial to the bones of our ancestors.
You have to take into account the way people feel about their loved ones, about their deceased ancestors. You cannot practice a type of anthropology where you just come into a community, take away skeletal remains, never report on your findings, or never take into account how people feel on what you're doing.
The onus was on us as scientists to demonstrate that the research we could do was of value, even though that research meant destroying, at least for a time, a sacred site.
My purpose for being here today is to bring you an update.
Blakey used a new approach that is related to a tradition of African-American anthropologists known as activist scholarship. He calls it engaged anthropology, where scientists work with the community, consulting the community on key decisions.
Involving the analysis of the skeletal remains, of the ancestral remains.
In the end, the General Services Administration revised its plan for the building, reducing its size so that more graves would not be disturbed. And the bones were delivered to Howard University in a ceremony that paid respect to the ancestors.
The transfer of these human remains from New York City to Howard University is an important and a touching moment for all of us.
I found, as many did, tremendous symbolic significance. We had won.
It was a victory.
It was a victory. There was a sense of triumph. It was a moment meant for healing and understanding. Now we finally were able to conduct our research and to conduct it in our own way.
It seemed to many that the skeletons had come back for a reason, in order to convey some important message for today. But it would take scientists several years before they would understand that message. In the meantime, they would work to shed light on one of the most elusive stories in American history, the personal story of life under slavery. What we know of the lives of slaves in this country is based on very little information from the enslaved themselves. Not permitted to read or write, they left few letters or diaries. The records of their lives were maintained by those who claimed to own them, so that their own stories have never fully been heard. What we do know from historical documents is that for 300 years, hundreds of thousands of Africans were forced from their homeland and brought here against their will.
Human beings were stolen from Africa. You have to put yourself in the place of the African who's being captured. It wasn't a question of going into the interior or going to the coast, arriving on the coast and said, as I tell my students, I'd like to have you come with me. It was a question of actually going into the interior and creating violence, that people had never seen before.
They were crowded into ships for a journey that would last from 30 to 60 days.
It's called the Middle Passage, from Africa to the Americas, and it was hell for African people.
They came to a land where they were valued not as people, but as property, where the laws saw them as nothing better than livestock.
Africans are listed as, in the same way domestic animals are, cows and horses and pigs. Very seldom do you, in fact, see a name given to an enslaved person.
Family relationships were not recognized, and children were sold away from their mothers.
You have enslaved African women who literally drown their children in New York rather than have them continue a life of servitude.
The codes of law designed to control them were unbelievably strict, prohibiting any form of African tradition. They were not allowed to meet in groups, not allowed to beat a drum at a funeral. But many resisted.
These were Africans who did not want to be, enslaved by another human being. You say, how dare you enslave me? I'm a human like you are.
They lived with few rights and little freedom of movement. That we know from history. But what we don't know is how they persevered. What was important to them? What were their secrets? With history unable to supply many answers, now science, historical archaeology is stepping in, searching for items that tell the story of the private, hidden world of those enslaved. Across the South, archaeologists are at work, and as these scientists make their discoveries, they are, in subtle ways, rewriting America's history. In the 1700s, while the New York burial ground was being used by enslaved Africans, a town in the South called Williamsburg was growing fast. Today, that town has been masterfully recreated as America's largest living history museum, Colonial Williamsburg. What is surprising to many visitors here is that on the eve of the American Revolution, more than half the population of Williamsburg was black.
Thank you, sir.
It's a fact that was not always well appreciated here. But today, African American interpretation is an official part of the program. In the spring of 1989, Colonial Williamsburg unveiled a full representation of slave life at a plantation called Carter's Grove.
Welcome to Carter's Grove and to our reconstructed slave quarter. Everything that you're about to see here has been entirely rebuilt on the original location using only 18th century tools and techniques, making this site one of the only one of its kind in the United States and possibly in the world.
Reproductions like this are based in part on the findings of historical archaeologists, like Maria Franklin. She headed a colonial Williamsburg excavation of a slave cabin at a nearby plantation called Rich Neck.
So Rich Neck looked much like this?
Rich Neck probably looked a whole lot like this. You have to keep in mind that Rich Neck, it was a satellite plantation, so Philip Ludwell III and his family did not actually live there.
What were the conditions inside?
Crowded, more than likely. I mean, by our standards, certainly. But for them, they were quite accustomed to living 5 to, a 10 by 10 room.
It is just how former slaves have described it.
Sure, I remember slavery times, 'cause I was 83 years old now. I was 11 when the breakup comes. We uns lived in cabins built from logs, and they am just like all the other cabins in slavery time, with dirt floor, no windows, just holes in the wall.
Descriptions like that come from a series of interviews of people born into slavery in the 1800s. The recollections of these men and women were compiled as part of a federal government project during the Depression, in which 2,000 former slaves were interviewed. It is a rare and valuable source of personal information.
I wore white chillins cast-off clothes. I had to pin 'em up with red horse thorns to hide my nakedness. My dress was usually split from hem to neck, and I had to wear 'em till they were strings. The times I hated most was picking cotton when the frost was on the ball. My hands would get so sore that they would crack open and bleed.
When the interviews were done in the 1930s, many people were reluctant to talk about slavery. But today, the feeling has changed. Today, people believe we must talk about it.
The system of oppression that existed under slavery, that has been passed on. There's still racism in this country. But you don't sweep those past experiences under the rug. Coming to grips with it is something that must be done in order to rise above it.
As colonial Williamsburg comes to grips with the subject of slavery, they are collecting a huge amount of information. Last summer, crews removed and bagged nearly 7,000 liters of soil from the slave cabin Maria Franklin was excavating. All of it is now being inspected through a process called flotation. As the soil is put in water, the lighter materials float to the top and are separated out.
Now look at this. Look at this. That is a tooth. Wow.
Now, if you look at the tooth and compare it to the
I would
pig,
say a sheep.
are probably larger. This is a cow.
I didn't expect this. I could spend the afternoon here.
Inside the laboratory, materials from the slave cabin are given close scrutiny. Animal bones are examined to determine the slave diet. Seed remains are inspected to understand medicinal uses of plants within the quarter. And 2,500 artifacts that were found at Rich Neck are also studied. The challenge is to assign meaning to things that are at times ambiguous.
I mean, they really copied this down to a T.
One of the most intriguing finds has been spoon handles.
These spoons are very interesting because you see a wide range of use. Some of these spoons have been drilled, as you can see. They've been filed and purposely broken off at the where the spoon meets the bowl.
Maria Franklin believes that the spoon handles may have been something important, perhaps something spiritual. In the 18th century, enslaved Africans were being baptized and converting to Christianity. But as Maria Franklin and others well know, that did not mean they gave up the ideas they came with. African-inspired religious beliefs continued, and in the narratives of enslaved African Americans, there were constant references to charms worn to ward off or attract spirits.
We all knowed about the Word and the unseen Son of God. We didn't put no stock in the conjure. Of course, we all had luck charms and good and bad sides, but everybody got them nowadays.
The spoon handles may have been the charms of the enslaved Africans at Rich Neck.
And what we believe they were doing is they were wearing these as pendants, flat. And the reason why is because pewter, as you can see, as most metals are reflective. They have reflective properties. And one of the ways that you protected yourself was to call upon a good spirit, to try and capture a good spirit, to use it to ward off evil. And spirits were attracted by things that reflect.
The spoon handles demonstrate in a small way how enslaved Africans coped with the rigors of slavery, looking to their past by making use of something in their present in order to form a new identity in a world that had taken almost everything else away. It's a process that is reflected in sites across the South. Nearly 300 years ago, this land on the banks of the James River in Virginia was a tobacco plantation and home to some of the first Africans to be sent to the colonies. Today, it is being cleared to make way for a new subdivision. Amid the noise and destruction, a small group of archaeologists is working. Quickly. Garrett Fessler is in charge of the dig for the James River Institute of Archaeology.
Handle.
They are sifting through the remains of what was literally a trash pit.
This truly is an extraordinary pit. They are around in Virginia, but to find a pit of this magnitude with this much stuff in it, there are thousands of artifacts in here. It's fairly rare. Remember that most of these people didn't have access to books or writing, so when we find a pit with this many things in it and with this many items, it's sort of like sifting through a text of their lives.
The whole area is just littered with wine glass fragments, ceramics, pipe stems.
Years ago, people argued that enslaved Africans brought nothing with them in terms of possessions or even traditions. But that is easily disproven at sites like this one.
This is a bead made of ebony. It's a wood found in Africa, and we believe that this was brought over by someone in the Middle Passage and probably worn here as a fairly cherished item, something that would remind them of the life that they once had in Africa. We're finding other artifacts that are giving us a sense that people are looking back to what they once knew for a sense of identity as well.
A trash pit yields a somewhat random selection of items people no longer found useful. To find more deliberate practices, often the best place to look is at a burial site. A year ago, a short distance from here, Fessler and his team unearthed a cemetery. 25 graves were found. He found tobacco pipes that were placed under the arms, beads that encircled a child's neck, traditions that could be traced directly back to Africa. It is strikingly similar to what was found at the African burial ground in New York City. While the bones are being examined at Howard University, scientists in New York, like Cheryl LaRoche, have been studying the artifacts found with the skeletons. Several of the burials were found with artifacts, but by far one of the most significant items came from burial 340. It was a woman, only in her mid-30s, and she had a string of 111 beads encircling her waist. In some parts of Africa, waist beads are a sign of status, possibly royalty. In others, they are a time-honored tradition.
There are so few examples in North America that tie us directly back to Africa, and her beads speak strictly of African cultural practices. We do not have to speculate with this particular burial.
Because the history of Africans in this country has been so buried, this small gesture makes a powerful statement.
Here we have something that says you had a strong cultural heritage. Not only do you have a strong cultural heritage, you have a cultural heritage that people found important. They found it important enough to let this woman go on her journey with these beads. It really speaks to the fact that we are not a new people here in North America, that we do have a much longer cultural heritage, a much longer heritage than frequently people understand about African Americans.
What is emerging from the work of historical archaeologists is a picture of life under slavery that is more complex than has been commonly understood. The picture is made even more complicated by the fact that enslaved people were held under a huge range of experiences. At the high end of the spectrum were places like this. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, built this house in Nashville, Tennessee in 1821. He called it the Hermitage.
I would like to welcome you to the Hermitage today. You're visiting us at a very exciting time. We've almost completed an extensive restoration effort. It's taken us the better part of 2 years.
It's a national landmark that draws 250,000 visitors each year.
The wallpaper here in the hallway is of a French scenic design. The paper is
Over the past 10 years, $2.5 million has been spent to restore the house to its former glory. But the Hermitage was more than the home of a hugely popular president. it was also a cotton plantation, where more than 100 men, women, and children were held as slaves. For the last century, their story has been virtually invisible. But today, the Hermitage is joining the trend of unburying the shameful past, and work is underway here to discover the story of slavery. Larry McKee is the director of archaeology for the Hermitage and is in charge of a team excavating a slave quarter that was discovered in 1988.
It was a surprise, especially because it's so close to the house. People immediately began to think, slaves lived this close to the mansion? And of course they did.
We're in a destruction level, which means we're seeing chimney fall, sort of rubble. Underneath this level, we're going to see an occupation layer, which means we're actually going to hopefully see a real nice context for artifacts that'll really only date from the 1820s until this building came down. So that's the goodies layer that we're really looking forward to.
As they dig down, the scientists find what the inhabitants of this cabin perhaps regarded as trash. To them, it's treasure.
This is a glazed doll leg, and you can see how it probably would have been her thigh.
It's almost, kind of a reverence that you get from this, knowing that this gives us that direct connection to it.
Ceramic, glass.
The work here is revealing much about the details of the lives of individuals. But many involved in the work see its real importance as going beyond simply rewriting the history of this plantation.
Race is such an important issue in contemporary society today, and the problems that we have in race relations have some very deep roots in our country. And I think it's important for us to examine those roots at a site that brings so many people to see what many consider a national hero.
Andrew Jackson made his name as a hero as a general in the War of 1812. He is certainly less well known as an owner of slaves, but records show that at one time he had more than 140 enslaved African Americans at the Hermitage. One of them was Hannah, bought by Jackson when she was 8 years old. When she was 89, living as a free woman in Nashville, she described the death of the president to a newspaper reporter. She said that about an hour before he died, he turned, saying, "I want you all to meet me in heaven. My words are for you all. God is no respecter of color." Then Hannah said, "Our master, our father, was gone." Hannah's interview offers a view of slavery that some people have always wanted to believe, an idealized picture of devoted servants who were content with their situation. It was the kind of image promoted by wealthy, influential Southerners like Jackson, who were anxious to showcase their plantations as places where people were treated well. And so Jackson was willing to give decent food and kind words, but he was not willing to give the most important thing of all: freedom.
Jackson showed great human compassion and interest. But did he believe in emancipation? Not on your life. He never emancipated the slave. His will never set one slave free. In fact, it confirmed ownership of slaves that he had given to his daughter-in-law and to his grandsons along the way. I don't think it ever crossed his mind that emancipation would be a good thing.
Over the years, Larry McKee and other Hermitage archaeologists have excavated 8 slave cabins and have learned much about the lives of the people who lived in them.
We're something like 650 yards, about a third of the mile from the mansion itself. And
McKee has found that the slaves carried guns and hunted their own food.
Firing mechanisms from guns, some gun flints, which to some degree goes against the common wisdom about what slave life was like, that those folks near
He has examined the structure of the cabins and can provide an understanding of what they were like inside. But for McKee, What would be most interesting would be to find something that Andrew Jackson didn't know about, perhaps didn't even allow. Evidence of a life quite separate from the one controlled by the big house. And he has found it in a very small charm, in the shape of a fist. In all, 3 different fist charms have been found.
Now, we, again, know a lot from African American folklore that a generic term for any kind of a charm is the term that's often used as a hand. It must have been very special to the people who were here. Imagine what it must have taken to obtain these things. It's not the kind of thing that the Jacksons would have given out. And really, anybody viewing this particular item, you know, is drawn to it. It's a very strong image, and the idea of what's going on with this, I think, has intrigued a lot of people. And part of the intrigue is, I think, that we don't know what's going on with it.
The charms are evidence of the private world here, that the slaveholders could neither control nor understand. And while their exact use remains a mystery, they're a measure of how far apart the 2 worlds on this plantation were. The distance is also seen in a story told about Alfred. Born into slavery at the Hermitage, he became friends with a tutor who came to live at the house.
One day, the tutor asked him, "You don't have it so bad here, do you? I mean, really think about it. Your life here, you have enough to eat, you have a house for your family," and Alfred was not disagreeing, but finally it came down to Alfred saying to him, "But I'm still a slave. Would you trade all of that? Would you accept all of that and for the fact that you'd be a slave?" And the tutor just ends the anecdote with, "I had no answer for
that." Almost 3 years have passed since the bones discovered at the African burial ground were sent to Howard University. One corner of the burial ground has now been declared a National Historic Landmark, and several times each year, a celebration is held to pay respect to the people still buried here. As for the skeletons that were excavated, it is now time for the story of their lives to be told. At Howard, scientists have cleaned and measured the bones and have determined that they have 427 individuals.
So this is a young individual.
As they have reconstructed the bones, they have also reconstructed the details of the people's lives.
This is very rare. We're going to make sure to photograph this.
The person with the musket ball turned out to be a woman. On close inspection, it was learned that she had been shot in the back. Her face showed she had been struck, and her arm was twisted. It was possible now to begin to suggest a scenario for her death.
This was a woman who was resisting, and she was violently put down. She was violently killed. We all know that slavery was violent, either, you know, in sort of quiet ways or very dramatic ways, like someone being hung or shot or whatever. But to see it with your own eyes, to see that evidence is just, it's different than reading about it, because you can see it.
I figured that anytime someone is enslaved, that the life is going to be pretty difficult. But a lot of times, even though people were just domestic workers, they were still doing such heavy work that, you know, even their bones are now battered. And we have the evidence right here to show that it was horrible for everybody. And it wasn't as simple as just having people work for you. It was just dehumanizing.
For centuries, it has been easy to write words and draw pictures about slavery, to offer images of its cruelty. But it has been more difficult to demonstrate how the rigors of forced labor affected a person's physical well-being. Drawings of people required to work exceedingly hard look like this. the bones of those people look like this.
Here, for instance, we have a male, an adult male, who has a very large, very robust arm. This is the bone from his upper arm. And in
Cassandra Hill is an osteologist here.
Normally, it's just, you can see it's just a very shallow groove here, but adequate for the attachment of the muscle. Whereas over here, the muscle was being used much too strenuously.
This furrow dug deep into the bone is caused when the muscles in arms and legs are used with such frequency and in such strenuous activity that the muscles are actually pulled from the bone, taking pieces of bone with them. It is called an enthesiopathy. The defect was found in the majority of both men and women. It suggests that there was little limit to what was expected of the enslaved. In some cases, people were clearly worked to death, as is seen in a series of fractures. One of the most common was caused by a practice of carrying loads on the head, a possible scenario for one woman's injury to the base of her skull.
So what happened probably was that she was carrying something on top of her head that was, perhaps it wasn't balanced correctly. She may have slipped, she may have stumbled. It may have been very heavy. It may have been a combination of all of these things. As she was walking along, then the cranium was jarred down onto the spinal column, and it punched a hole in the base of her head. And she may not have died immediately, but she would have died within a few days after that.
If one of the best indicators of the health of a population is the health of its children, then the population of enslaved Africans in New York was in very poor shape. Half of the skeletons excavated belonged to children, many under the age of 2. Of those who survived past 2 years old, they were plagued by poor nutrition and disease. These are the leg bones of Burial 17, a 5-year-old child with rickets. The teeth of Burial 39, a 4-year-old child, likely suffering poor nutrition or prolonged illness.
As human beings, we look at faces. Faces are how we recognize each other as human and as individual people. So when you're working with a skull and there's the face and this is a small child, you really think about, oh, this was a child of only 5 who died, and why did this child die? And this was in the 1700s, and this child was living the life of a slave.
Let's go to the other skull and teeth that you had in mind.
In some children, the result was that their growth was actually delayed. They had a 1-year lag between skeleton growth and dental ages. In others, there was an even more dramatic consequence.
All right, this is the calvarium, or brain case, and part of the face of a young person who was about 6 years of age. Usually there's an ossification center, a suture, right along here, called the sagittal suture. Those ossification centers close and become obliterated with age. In an individual of this age, where development is taking place rapidly, that suture should be very much open.
Yes.
I should
and
say,
it's gone completely.
It's gone
there,
completely. This is one of the most perplexing findings that we have to date.
The developmental defect is called craniosynostosis, and today is found in 1 in 1,000 to 2,000 children. In colonial New York's enslaved population, at least 12 cases have been found in 200. It's a dramatic finding, and the scientists are exploring environmental causes. What they have found so far is that in almost all of the children suffering from the premature closing of the brain, there is a record of stress in the study of their teeth.
So we see that this child has a misshapen skull, but from the teeth we can see a number of other things. You can see in the child's mandible serious, severe cavities of the deciduous or primary teeth. But with the permanent teeth, you can see enamel defects as well. And in this case, we're looking at enamel hypoplasia.
The defects in the enamel are especially telling. The scientists know that enamel is laid down at a specific rate as a child grows. When defects in the enamel are found near the top of the tooth, at the chewing surface, it's a sign of poor nutrition or other stresses close to the time of birth. Defects closer to the gum line are a sign of problems later in childhood. In this case, the defects are very close to the top.
We can see at the time of birth and probably when the child is breastfeeding, the mother may have poor nutrition, which is being carried on to the child. So it could be that this child is set up for deteriorating health throughout his or her life so that he or she dies by the time they're 4 or 5 years old. Life had to be very hard for this child, a very short life, but a very difficult life.
In many ways, the work here has just begun. More will be learned from DNA studies of the skeletons. But so far, the scientists have identified these people as individuals who endured great physical hardship. But they have also learned about another side to their lives, a side that speaks very clearly about courage and perseverance. The evidence for that also stems from the teeth. The scientists have found at least 20 people with teeth that have been deliberately shaped.
Tooth filing was done for a number of reasons. For ethnic affiliation, aesthetic reasons, it's beautiful, and as a rite of passage. Once you become a full member of a specific society, you would have your teeth filed so that everyone could see that you belong to the Ashanti people or the Akan people.
The simple carving of the teeth makes it possible to place these individuals as people who grew to adulthood in Ghana and suffered the trip from Africa. They came to a place where the traditions of their lives were not understood and not allowed. And yet, despite the efforts to control every aspect of their lives, there was on the coffin of Burial 101 a symbol made of brass tacks. Many who first saw it believed it to be a heart. Michael Blakey was not convinced.
I was very bothered, increasingly bothered by that symbol. It seemed to me that I had seen it somewhere before.
It was later that Blakey saw a list of symbols used by the Ashanti people in Ghana, called Adinkra symbols.
And there it was, the heart shape, an ornate heart shape, a little different from the one on Burial 101, but it seemed to be closer to that symbol than the usual heart shape in the Western sense.
It is called Sankofa, and it symbolizes the need for people to look to their past, to their ancestors, to understand their future, a fitting symbol for this project. But today, the people here see it also as something else, as a symbol of resistance.
I definitely see the Sankofa symbol as a form of resistance because you resist the notion that you must relinquish your culture.
It is what much of historical archaeology of slavery is discovering. And along the banks of the James River, the artifacts are seen in much the same way.
What we're finding on this site are forms of resistance that are not going to be known in history books per se. They're going to be the quieter forms, the covert forms of trying to resist against a system that is trying to control you entirely. And so I think by wearing shells in your hair, by doing certain things that are replicating what you knew from Africa, I think those are very important forms of resistance in and of themselves that we must not ignore.
It is the private story of life under slavery that is coming to light today. A story of people who endured a brutal system designed to destroy their sense of identity. but who still did not give up their own sense of who they were.
When they buried their dead, they had some privacy, and they could leave those dead with a few symbols of who they really knew themselves to be. And whenever you have that sort of thing, what you're looking at is a kind of courage. That comes through very clearly for me in a population like the one we're seeing here.
The bones I'm going to show you are from people who lived up to approximately 300 years ago. They're very old.
Almost every week, children come into this laboratory as part of a school tour.
This is the side of the head right here. Yeah.
Some might argue that they are the reason the bones came out of the ground, so that a new history could be learned.
Now, do you read about slavery in New York City? How many people read about slavery in New York City?
These children will grow up knowing that enslaved Africans built the foundations of the city of New York, and they will know of the hardship of their lives.
400 of those skeletons.
See, this is the lower jaw right here. Yeah, this is the baby. It's about 9 months old.
And it died already?
Yeah.
A lot of children.
There's a lot of children that died because of not getting enough to eat and because of the sickness and stuff like that.
The baby, that's the lower jaw.
That's the lower jaw.
It is what the Sankofa symbol is all about, the past informing the future.
What do you see here?
Heart.
But remember, you asked the question, what was all this stuff inside
Right.
of it?
What's all the stuff inside here? Does it look like the heart that you normally draw?
No.
Okay. Now maybe it's the same shape as the heart, but maybe it has a different meaning.
Yes, but
And what these children will take away is a very clear picture that their past is full of heroes.
So this now, is it a heart that means love the way people think about it?
no.
It has a different meaning.
I think hero is a good term to describe the people who were buried at the African burial grounds. We would not be here were it not for them. The nation would not be here were it not for them. They had to believe that we would come about. They had to believe that there would be a better future. How else could one survive what they survived without some sort of belief in a better future?
For more information about this program, visit the New Explorers on the PBS homepage at pbs.org.
Mm-hmm.